Well, we're moving along in our study of the apostles, and Peter will try and get him finished up today, but I was thinking there's so much in Peter's life that, examples, good examples to us, and warnings of the dangers of us falling short. But I thought, well, we can't spend forever on Peter, so I tried to pick and choose. But as I thought about life experiences with Peter, and if you recall, the 3 years of Jesus's ministry was an up and down time for Peter. Peter struggled, had good times, had hard times, no different than us. And he learned many things about what it took to be a disciple. And often things went well, but other times not so well. And however, though, we see that Peter was being built and, as I said, carved out and shaped as to be a worker for Christ. And Peter, of course, saw incredible things. He experienced humbling things, and he endured much, as we see. And yet, he could have amounted to nothing, right? We give up. He could have given up. But instead, he learned from his experiences. He cherished them, and he used them to make himself who he became. And they can be examples for us, of course. So Peter's life experiences tell us something. First of all, it tells us that not all character qualities are come by naturally. Remember, we spoke of Peter being outspoken, outgoing, and others being shy. But not all qualities come naturally. Some that are gained through experiences must still be built upon. Okay, things that we move ourselves ahead on, we have to keep moving ahead on, keep building. Jeff?
So if Peter was a real person, we sometimes forget these people are real people. Like they struggle with the same things. They struggled and they grew, and they like I said, that's I think the point of seeing these people. They're not perfect,
right?
But they grow,
right?
And they can be the examples of how to grow.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. Jeff?
I do find that many people are very concerned about where the qualities or characteristics in people come from.
Okay.
They're concerned, are we born a certain way? Some people want to say, we're born a certain way. And others are, no, we learn things as we live. We learn from experiences. I think it's a waste of time to worry about where our characteristics or character qualities come from.
Mm-hmm.
What God requires us to do with our characters. And as we've already mentioned, to grow.
Yep.
If a characteristic is not right, it doesn't matter where it came from. We need to change that characteristic that we have.
Right.
We see that in Peter. He needed to change some things about himself. He needed to be careful with that. And other things he needed to grow and do better at. And some things he did well that he needed to continue with.
Right.
It's not a concern of where they come from, it's what we do with them, what choices we make.
Right. Exactly. But that's a good point, though, too, for parents, because most of us, our qualities are starting to form when we're young, the way our parents raise us and teach us. Of course, though, some of us our brains are all wired different. Some of us are slower learners than others. But that's not something to be ashamed of. That's just the way it is. But once, as Jeff says, once we begin growing and learning, then those are the things that we need to build upon. We're not all doctors and lawyers, but in the framework of God's kingdom, there's room and work for all of us. We just have, some of us might have to work harder on it, speaking of memory, than others. But nonetheless, those are, as Jeff says, qualities that we need to work on. But I wanted us to just look at John 13, that story again. And you know the story. I won't bother reading it all. But if you remember here, this is the last Passover now that Jesus spends with his apostles. He's gathered with them. And all the gospel writers record this gathering and speak of it, but only John records the scene with Jesus washing his disciples' feet here. And Jerusalem at that time was a busy place, as we think about that. And rooms, remember Jesus sent 2 disciples on ahead to find a room for them. And rooms were made available to the thousands of pilgrims that would come to Jerusalem for the celebration of the Passover. And there was usually a servant supplied with that room who would wash the feet of the guests. That was a tradition. In those days, we didn't have socks and shoes. People wore sandals, and their feet, after walking a dirt road for miles, are pretty dirty. Well, the servants would wash the feet of the guests before their meal. And here in verse 4 of John 13, we see that Jesus takes the role of that servant. And think about that. He's ready to teach the disciples a lesson on humility, is the whole purpose. And it's a well-needed lesson at that. And not only for Peter. I wanted to make that point a few times in our lesson. But anyways, earlier after Jesus mentioned, if you recall, that one of the 12 would betray him. And we see them all very concerned about that. They're searching their own hearts. They're questioning themselves about their love for Jesus. But they also, which is amazing, Luke 22 tells us that they argued with one another over who was the greatest among them. Imagine men doing that here at this scene, which tells us, I make this point because which tells us that along with Peter, they all needed a lesson on humility. Here they are arguing with one another over who is the greatest in the kingdom. And just as a reminder here, as we discuss Peter, Matthew 26, verses 33 and 35, this is where Peter, in his typical form, speaks out before the rest of the apostles. But Peter says here, even if all are made to stumble because of you, I will never stumble. And then in verse 35, we read again, Peter said to him, even if I have to die with you, I will not deny you. Okay, so right away we jump on Peter for those remarks, but look at what Luke tells us. And so said all the disciples. Luke's the one that records that. It wasn't only Peter that jumped out. Peter was the one that spoke up, but all the other disciples after Peter said the same thing. And Mark 14 and verse 29, again Peter says, even if all are made to stumble, yet I will not be. But he spoke more vehemently, if I have to die with you, I will I will not deny you. And again, and they all said likewise. It wasn't only Peter. It was all the disciples at the time. And then Luke 22 and verse 33, but he said to him, Peter said to Jesus, Lord, I am ready to go with you both to prison and to death. And the reason, and then John 13:37, when Peter said that, Lord, why can I not follow you now? I will lay down my life for your sake. So the reason I pointed that out was because sometimes when people fall, okay, their faith slips or they stumble, we're on their backs. And we can be very harsh about it. But I put these verses up to see that the gospel writers told us that all the disciples agreed and said the same thing. But which made me think sometimes those that are, in Peter's case, outspoken, so maybe I know that Peter's going to speak up. I agree. I have the same thought as Peter, but I let him go ahead and say it. So we learn from that, and we learn when we're studying, especially Peter, I thought, we need to be careful. We get down on him and point him out all the time. Thinking of the times that he, especially when he denied the Lord. The rest of them weren't any different. It's just that the Holy Spirit decided to record Peter of what he said. But I just thought that's kind of a good reminder. But the Holy Spirit, of course, as I said, only records Peter's words. But then, as we said before, Peter was usually always the one that spoke out first, while others sometimes take advantage of that and will sit back and say nothing. And so then we see in verse 6 of our passage that Peter finds it hard. Okay, we're in the scene now where Jesus is washing their feet. Peter finds it hard to believe that Jesus would do this. And that's understandable. They've walked with Jesus now for, this is nearing the end of 3 years, I would think. They've seen miracles done, and here's Jesus washing their feet. That is pretty astounding when you think about it. But when Jesus, look what he says to Peter. At the end of verse 6 there, he says, you don't understand why right now, why I am doing this. But later you will. Okay? Now we might think to ourselves, Peter should have maybe hesitated and given that thought, those words some thought. That was advice from Jesus. But Peter speaks up again, we see. And he says, never shall you wash my feet. And I think again here, Peter is displaying his self-will. Okay? Instead of considering what the Lord's purpose is in doing this servile act, Peter blurts out and says that. But you notice when Jesus tells Peter that he can have no part with him. Now Peter, that's hit home. Peter is stunned by that thought because I believe Peter fears now that he's going to lose fellowship with Jesus. And he tells Jesus again then, he says that he will accept a thorough cleaning from Jesus. Clean my feet, clean my hands. And he displays the fact again that he still doesn't get Jesus' purpose in doing what Jesus is doing. And if you think about it, first he tells Jesus what he shouldn't do, and now he's telling Jesus how to do it. You know, that's, and of course, when Jesus is finished washing his disciples, he explains to them why he's done that. And I thought of Philippians 2 and verse 7. Jesus came to serve, and he's trying to have his disciples understand that that is what they are going to do. But we just see the dangers sometimes of blurting out and not thinking before we speak. And I thought, well, what can we take from Jesus' statement of that? When Jesus said, what I do you don't realize now, but you will understand hereafter. What can we draw from that for ourselves? What do you see? If you were in Peter's shoes, thinking about why we're looking at the apostles, what do you think? Do we not mature through life experiences? If we don't, we should. If we don't, we're right, we should. But by thinking about that, by maturing, by learning through experiences, these things, such as this moment here with Jesus, will be seen and understood if we make that effort to advance ourselves, to become mature, to learn. And also, I thought just for us, we can also understand that without Christ's service, there wouldn't even be salvation for us. So we see and understand the whole role of what Jesus is trying to put forward to us here. So I wanted to look at just a few things from Peter's epistles. If you recall now, Peter went on to write. This man that we're picking out his mistakes at this time, this man went on to write 2 epistles. And so I wanted us to show that he did learn and did eventually, of course, we know he became a leader in the Lord's church, became an elder. But what Peter eventually learned are things that we need to learn also. And I thought of submission. Maybe we'll read these quickly. But first off, Peter is a leader, okay? He knew all too well the responsibility that leaders have over their followers. And as we see in our world today, nations who will not submit to the Lord operate in confusion. And submission to the Lord is a challenge for Christians. And that's why Peter wrote these words, to help keep the Lord's church functioning and pure. So we'll look at 1 Peter chapter 2. 1 Peter chapter 2. If we read this, maybe we'll take 3 verses each. 3 verses each. Maybe I'll start on this side with Jer, and then we'll move back.
Okay. Therefore, submit yourselves to every ordinance of man for the Lord's sake, whether to the king as supreme, or to governors, as to those who are sent by him for the punishment of evildoers, and for the praise of those who do good. For this is the will of God, that by doing good you may put to silence the ignorance of foolish men.
Live as people who are free, not using your freedom as a cover-up for evil, but living as servants of God. Honor everyone, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the emperor. Servants, be subject to your masters with all respect, not only to the good and gentle, but also to the unjust.
For this commendable, because of conscience toward God, one endures grief, suffering wrongly. For what credit is it if, when you are beaten for your faults, you take it patiently? But when you do good and suffer, if you have take it patiently, it is commendable before God.
Okay, we see from this passage, has Peter learned what submission is all about?
Yeah.
Of course, yeah. He's learned through his life experiences now that we must submit to the Lord. And his purpose is to help us along. And Ephesians 5 and verse 1, Ephesians 5 and verse 1, Jeff, I'll give you that verse. Ephesians 5 and verse 1.
Therefore be imitators of God as dear children. That's one.
Oh no, I put down the wrong verse. Submit to one another. I'm not sure where I found that.
Wait a second.
I'll have to scan that.
That's
Ephesians
that's
5, verse 1,
Verse 9.
verse 9. For
Uh,
the fruit of the Spirit is in all goodness,
Oh.
righteousness, and truth.
okay, no, that.
you might have been in 1 Peter 5, verse 5.
Oh, that
Which
might have.
says, likewise, you younger submit yourselves to the elders. Yes, all you be submissive to one another, and be clothed with humility.
Right. So,
For God resists the proud, but gives grace to the humble.
okay, sorry. Yeah, that's the one. I don't know how I put that. Got that confused, but that's the verse I was after.
And verse 21.
Like 21.
Oh, you're in Ephesians 5:21. Okay.
But 1 Peter
Oh,
5,
5:21?
verse 5 says, likewise, you younger people, submit yourself to your elders. Yes, all of you be submissive to one another and be clothed with humility. For God resists the proud, but gives grace to the humble.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you, Sharice. That was the verse I was after, yes. So Peter obviously learned, and he's encouraging us, isn't he, by these words. Not only encouraging, those are commands to us that we need to heed. So submissiveness certainly must be learned. And like I said, not only to Jesus, but for all relationships involving authority, as we read, and to one another. We need to submit to one another. And it goes without saying that, no, we're not certainly saying that we submit to evil practices or evil thoughts. We know that it goes without saying. But, Jared?
Peter was the one who told us that.
Right.
Like in Acts 5. Like
Yes.
at first, that's the assumption. He's writing to Christians. The assumption is that they're like, as far as they're punishing evildoers, that means they are doing right. The ordinances are right.
Right.
So that needs to be the default position. Okay, is the ordinance right? If it is, submit to it.
Right.
Like as far as that's a hard thing for the Christian, because there are a lot of ordinances we don't like. May not be
Yes.
wrong, but we don't like them.
Yeah.
And yet we're still told to submit.
Exactly. Yeah, it is a challenge. And the second thing I thought of was humility. To be submissive, one must be humble. It just has to be that way. But it's a quality that's not often inherited. But it must be developed also. It's something that we have to work on and develop. It seems when we're children, we always want things our way. And sadly to say, sometimes that can remain with us into our adult days as we get older. But one of the greatest challenges for us is not to think more highly of ourselves than we should. And that's a challenge not only in our daily lives, in our workplaces, but it's a challenge in the kingdom of God. It's a challenge inside the church. We can have that attitude very easily. And it's something we think of Peter. Sure. No, we think of Peter. You know, I remember Peter's boasting that I'll never fall away, and Lord, with you I am ready to go. And also, remember when he said, well, others may fall. You know, he's speaking to the other disciples in front of Jesus. These men may fall, but I won't. And we see that Peter has learned. He's, as we say, had to eat those words. Sure.
Our society has really trained people to think of themselves. We live in a very me, individualistic, selfish society. It's not saying others weren't, but I mean, as far as it's right in our face.
Right.
Like as far as that you fight for your rights, you lift yourself up. Like as far as doesn't almost in some cases doesn't matter what others like as far as if others get in your way, you like we've seen this, like help for others. So you go to other countries and you said they're going, wow, some of these people are a little bit more friendly than we're used to.
Yeah.
Because our society over here has been very rugged individualistic, and whereas Peter, like submitting to one another, not only involves humility, but it means willingness to help.
Yep.
Like I said, it's not just, okay, everyone does something for me, it's what can I do for you?
Right.
And like Jesus, that's what he was teaching in John 13, was that you serve others.
Exactly.
And it doesn't matter what position you're in either, you serve others. And be willing to be, like as far as be willing to be served by others. But
Right.
like as far as we serve one another, but we need to have the servant's attitude.
Right, exactly. Good point. We do live in a me-deep society. We see it every day. And to say that that doesn't affect us, I certainly wouldn't say that. You know, we're on missions every day. We're on missions at work, things that we're to do. We're on a mission on the road, and people get in our way. Look out. You know, we need to remind ourselves that, no, we're Christians, and we're to set the example. But we see that Peter learned that. He learned that from some of his heartbreaking experiences. I can only imagine how Peter felt in some of the situations when the Lord corrected him. And he knew his mistakes. He knew the shame that came from it, and he directs our attention to that thought. You know, in 1 Peter 5, verses 5 to 9. Hopefully I have that one right. I'll just check.
You do.
Oh, do it? Tammy, do you want to read that, please?
Likewise, you younger people, submit yourselves to your elders. Yes, all of you be submissive to one another, and be clothed with humility. For God resists the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Therefore humble yourselves under the mighty hand of God, that he may exalt you in due time, casting all your care upon him, for he cares for you. Be sober, be vigilant, because your adversary the devil walks about like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. Resist him, steadfast in the faith, knowing that the same sufferings are experienced by your brotherhood in the world.
Okay, thank you. Just reading that now, I remember at the desk getting all this messed up in my passages. But you know, when you read this, you can't help but understand that Peter, of course, speaking through the Holy Spirit, but Peter learned this. This isn't just something that comes natural, these verses. These need to be learned. We need to, you know, how many times in sermons do we hear examine ourselves? We hear it a lot around the Lord's table. You know, that's the only way that situations, commands here that Peter is laying out for us are learnt and taken to heart. We have to work on them and apply them in our lives, because it is not easy, as we said. And also, the last point I thought of was love. Okay? You know, we all think, oh, I don't have any problem loving, showing a loving attitude. Well, that may be true, but it becomes a problem when it's something that's maybe not to our liking, something that we don't really want to be a part of. And actually, Peter here in one of the versions, Peter says, keep fervent. Okay, fervent means impassioned and intense. It's funny Peter uses that word because that was Peter's attitude, all his characteristics. He was intense, and he was impassioned. That's why he spoke out sometimes before he thought. I think of Peter and John, you know, the years that they spent together, not only in serving the Lord, but in their workplace. They fished together daily. You know, they were buddies, if you would say. You know, and we see John always seemed to think before he spoke, seemed to think deeper. And Peter was just the opposite. Peter was more intense. Peter didn't have time to think something out. The first thing that came into his mind, he would blurt out. But who would have thought, as far as keeping fervent and loving, who would have thought that Peter needed any instruction in this area? Okay, but his choice in using that word tells me he learned a different meaning for love. Okay, his love was, he learned the true meaning of it. Might have examples like in John 13 when Jesus washed their feet. That was a beginning place for Peter to learn that. And I thought of in John 21. Remember, we see that Jesus, after his resurrection, he meets with his 12, if you remember that story. He met with his 12 apostles for the third time there, and he eats with them on the shores of Galilee. And I believe part of that experience would have been to have cemented in their minds the physical reality of his resurrection. Because I often wonder how many times did they eat together on the shores of Galilee. They were fishermen. You know, how often, not even on the shores of Galilee, how often would they have sat down with Jesus and ate with him? And I believe that's a part of Jesus' goal at that time, was to cement that in their mind, that this is my physical body. I have resurrected, because they are going to carry the gospel now to the world. So they needed to believe that and know that he had rose from the dead. But it was at that time, remember, that he confronts Peter. Remember, he confronted Peter with the question, do you love me more than these? And I believe he's speaking of the other apostles that the disciples that were with him at the time. But at that point, when Jesus said that, Peter's mind would have gone back to his words that he uttered. Remember when he said, even if all are made to stumble because of you, I will never be made to stumble? I believe Peter would have thought of that right away. There's nothing more powerful than being shamed. Some people can block those things out of their mind, but Christians, you can't block that out of your mind. And Jesus intended, I believe, for Peter to feel the shame of those words, of what he said to Christ. And I believe, too, that if Jesus had not spoke to Peter in this indirect way, it wasn't an indirect way that he speaks to Peter, but I believe if Jesus hadn't done that, Peter might have been haunted by those words for the rest of his life, thinking of what he said to Jesus. But by Jesus speaking to him in that way, Peter knew that Jesus had forgiven him. Jesus had put that behind himself and letting Peter know that he was restored now to his active service in the Lord. And as you read that passage and think about it deeply, that's what that passage is all about. It's all about forgiveness. Peter had lost his reputation with his Lord. He knew that. Jesus knows all, and of course Jesus would know the future, but in Peter's mind he had denied the Lord, and maybe even his hope of ever becoming what he knew he should be. Shame and guilt can cripple people. It can cripple you. You can live in that state. And that's why we need to remember and be honest in our hearts, seek forgiveness for what we've done wrong, and then know that the Lord has put that behind him. And I believe that whole passage here with Peter, that's what the Lord is trying to have us see. And because of what Christ did here, what happened with Peter? His future. He went on to be an elder. He went on to be a shepherd among saints, among the churches that he worked with. And I believe what a lesson for us here on how to restore one who has fallen in gentleness and meekness. And that doesn't mean to overlook sin, but there's ways of handling it. And here I think is a prime example with Christ. I mean, Jesus could have said to Peter, hey, you denied me 3 times. But Jesus didn't do that, did he? He worked it in a manner, though, that thought came to Peter. He was reminded of that. And yet, through Christ's correction, through his gentleness and meekness, Peter went on to be what he was. And I believe there's so much to glean from that passage, as we read that and think upon it.
I'm not ashamed to own my Lord.